Please welcome Mr. Steve Ellison and Mark Gray. We'll first talk to Steve about a little bit of the history of Spacemap. I have here a slide of a Spacemap timeline.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks for having me. Well, that first bit there shows a little picture of a geodesic dome. So I was in Australia. I have a background in music and engineering and computer science, and was interested was doing computer music on my own. When I went to Australia, I met up with a group that were working in multi-channel audio and had built a performance venue. So here's the dome. It was set up. This was a shot of it in Sydney. It was also moved to Canberra. Shout out to David Worrell, who's in Chicago now, who developed this and I worked with. And there are 16 loudspeakers. I can see at ear level, there's a ring of 5, and then there's another ring of 5 where the screens are, which also served as acoustic absorption. 5 here and 1 at the top. So it kind of ties into Mark Gray's work in that the idea for this was a multimedia computer music graphics circus, in a sense. There I am in the far left. We did not have digital matrices and laptops and iPads. We had, that's a Mac. That was a 128K Mac that before going to Australia, I upgraded to a Fat Mac with 512K of memory. So that dates the whole process. But in that room, we saw triangles everywhere, and we had to determine how to distribute sound. So the way we did this was kind of the prototyping environment. The original prototyping environment was to use a Mac running Mac 4. This was before Mac's MSP and other languages like that, and using the MIDI-man Mac interface to the Mac, controlling a pair of Yamaha TX816s. So that was basically 16 channels of DX7, which is an FM synthesis controlled with MIDI. And so by attaching one output to each loudspeaker, we could then change the level and give the impression of sound moving. And that was the beginning. And in that space, we considered other techniques, but I was looking at this sitting in there, and it just made sense to divide the room up into triangular panners. And so that's the basis of the TriSet and the Spacemap. This then evolved several years later. I was co-founder of LCS, and we developed a matrix system. Our first customer was Kenneth Feld for George Lucas's Super Live Adventure that toured arenas in Japan. So mid-'80s, geodesic dome, everything handmade. Early 90s, we're in an arena in Japan. And essentially what this is controlling a matrix. And this evolved in time to digital platform, LD88 and Matrix 3. Spacemap started in a computer music sound artist community. It grew and took off in live theater. And really live theater could really grasp the benefits of Spacemap. So for instance, these are 2 Spacemaps, and same venue, same loudspeaker layout. On the left, this gives us very continuous control over groups of speakers, very good for localizing. On the right, using virtual nodes, this gives us kind of generalized panning of, if we're in this corner, we are just sending sound to these 3, etc. So, and this was done with the kind of ancestral software behind the development of Spacemap over the years. So the interface looks different, but conceptually the Spacemap is the same under the hood. We assisted Zachary Seldis with bringing some of these tools into Mac's MSP, where you can experiment with this as MEAP. We'll shout out to Zachary. And there's been some really good academic work about Spacemap. There are some university courses in Europe that use Spacemap in Macs with MEAP as how they're teaching surround sound. So it's a different approach, as I'm sure Josh has gone through in other roundtables. It's an abstract panner, and that's a key element. But Spacemap really grew up in live theater in shows like Ka, for instance, Cirque du Soleil, that was still up and running up through when the pandemic hit. Here are just some different Spacemaps at Ka that show the flexibility, and with a single system, how you can create different Spacemaps to control the system in different ways. So it's a system approach to doing spatial sound. 2.5 years ago, we had the opportunity to work with MoogFest, and we decided we wanted to take it live. what we did was we developed tools for taking this technology and making it more like a live, interactive, mixable system. And that is really the foundation of what inspired Spacemap Go. And we took this venue, this is an armory in Durham, North Carolina. This was what we did a couple of years ago with this totem mount of UPJs in the center. And then in addition, we had UPJs on the surrounds, and we had leopards here in the front, a couple of arrays. We also did quad monitoring on stage. And then we had to quickly deploy different bands and different sets. There's 3 nights, in some nights there'd be 3 different artists. So how could we do this? We did this with this prototype, and I'll show you a bit about that. So there's a bit of the system design. I'll kind of skip over that, but it sounded great. Last year we did it with Ultra X40s and leopards, and it was really great. Some of the space maps. But this was 2 years ago. This was kind of the prototype behind what you now have had a chance to work with Spacemap Go since we've released it. This was what's the mix view. We had the ability, it was 6 at a time. We then last year updated that to do 8 at a time. So we had for each channel, we could crossfade between space maps and do level and mute and so forth. And we had this focus channel that provided control over an individual channel. So what you've seen is kind of where this grew up, historically, how this came to be.
I remember a couple years ago where we were at a dinner table, and it was right around the time that immersive audio became the buzzword of the day, and spatial sound became the buzzword in the pro audio industry. And I remember us being like, well, this has been around for 20 years. You've been doing this since the 80s, Steve. And so it's really cool to see how that has evolved. And the first question that we said was, we need to make this easy in order to make it usable for more than the theatrical sound designer or the giant spectacles. We want to be able to make this easy and accessible for anyone. And so that led to some decisions that you made. And the first one I had a question of was, we saw that MoogFest, but why the choice for the iPad over, a traditional desktop app that you've been using with previous iterations of Spacemap?
That's a great question. And I think since the 80s, but certainly into the early 90s, we always had this, I'll say it's a fantasy of trying to create a live spatial console. And back in the 90s, we kind of hacked it a little bit by using touchscreen technology. We did that actually on Broadway with Damn Yankees around 95, I think, 94, with a late, great Mark Dennis. But it was always kind of a kludge. It didn't really quite work. We were excited when Lemur came out, which was a hardware implementation of a multi-touch surface as programmable with OSC. So that happens, and I have to look it up, but either in the early aughts or late 90s, but I think early aughts around that time.
Yeah,
and
that sounds
for
about
this
right.
predated the iPad. And that was great. It was multi-touch, it was a little clunky, but it was a breakthrough. And then when iPads came out, then it became clear that, wow, this was hardware designed to be touched, designed to integrate the user experience with what you see and what you touch and what you control. So it's the perfect platform for a spatial audio console. So we used that for our prototyping, and at MoogFest, we had 3 at a time, all laid out with a custom frame we built. And we had this live audio console that was all spatial and all touch. And it'd be impossible to do that with a bunch of laptops, really would be. The other thing that we're able to use is a whole client server, so we can have multiples at a time. And so and Spacemap Go has that as well. You could have, I know, Josh, you've shown this in some of the other roundtables, you can have multiple iPads. I have 4 here for testing, and I've run them all at once. So you could look at different screens at a time, just laying out your console. So to me, the iPad was a natural for this. It worked great with Spacemap because Spacemap gives you a canvas for your sound system. And an iPad shows you a canvas, and then you can set it up in different ways. And what I'm showing you right here is the Spacemap for what I'm doing in my space here. I started with a pair of HD ones that are left and right. And then I added an MM4 as kind of a wing to the left, a center, and a right. I have an MM10 here, and then I have a UPM left and a UPM right. That's my system. So it's a 7-1, but it's kind of a different layout. It's 5 in the front, 2 surrounds, and then a sub. Now there are some extra nodes here. And what I've done just to make it easy for me is I just used the space map that existed that I liked and just had the same speaker go to that same output in the node. So here's a benefit of the abstraction. So here's the UPM channel 8, but I've also assigned it here. And so it's very nice. And same as like, here's my MM4. Well, I didn't have an additional MM4, so I just assigned that same node to that same MM4 in the wing. And this gives me a really nice surface to mix. And some of the content I'm working with, and shout out to Eric Hall, who is joining us on this, is he has released an album called Music for 18 Musicians. It is a version of, I'm gonna find Keynote here, is a version of Steve Reich's Music for 18 Musicians. It's a recording that he's produced and released. I reached out to him. I love the piece. I first experienced it in a Constellation installation in New York City. I worked with Steve Reich setting up the Constellation acoustics for a performance of this with a band. And Eric released an album where he played every part himself and then did a multi-track version and a mix, and it sounds amazing. So you can look that up. You can buy there's a vinyl version that I heard a couple of weeks ago. Sounds great. There's also, it's on Spotify or iTunes. So what I did was, let's go to my set list, and this is just a real quick beginning to show what sort of things I'm doing is that if we go to, this is pulses is one of the sections. And so in the overview here, I'm showing these are all different tracks, right? And this is just me testing. I haven't, the idea is hopefully we will present this as a multi-track experience that you could go visit. So artistically, what I'm interested in is, you see here's the score, okay? And here is some of the notes from Steve Reich about how to set up the musicians. So what I would love to do is then basically go here to the mix view and go to, say, set up these different instruments. So these are labeled with the instrumentation that Eric used to realize the piece, which might relate to, for instance, cello. Like I think he used Moog synth for the cello, etc., or guitars, and there are some of his own vocals in there. So I've just set a new mix, right? So now I want to go to the set list, and I'm going to create a channel snapshot for this, and I'm just going to include those instruments. And now I'm done. And let's say I wanted to do a transition time of 6 seconds. That's great. A wait time of 1 second. And I'm just going to call this test. So now what I've done is I have created a snapshot that sets the mix as I've just set it here in this overview. And if I go here and say, oh, here's one I've did, which is all front center. If I recall this one, go to the mix. There's all the channels converging to one loudspeaker. And now if I go here to this, which I just created for you, now they're all crossfading. And some of them are in the surrounds, and a couple of them are, and some of them are just in the frontal system. So it's a very quick way to do spatial orchestration, as we could call it. So what I just showed you that was so quick, in previous kind of ancestral software of QStation would have taken me a half hour or an hour. So that's where artistically for me, I see it as a mixing tool to quickly make a mix, listen, create a snapshot, and move on, right? And do something else. So what I envision, and Eric and I haven't worked out all the details on this, but he's interested, for instance, in performing this. So we'd have one of the tracks muted, and he would play live on stage, maybe playing Fender Rhodes or playing guitar or something like that, and then the other tracks would be multi-tracked.
Yeah.
That's the kind of thing that we could see doing this in a creative environment for doing music. And it doesn't have to be a huge system. You showed a stadium, but it sounds great here in my little studio space with 8 speakers. But that
Yeah.
workflow I just showed you is
Yeah.
incredibly hard to do with other tools.
And the cool thing is that workflow is consistent across scale. Again, it's an abstraction. A space map is an abstraction of the loudspeaker layout. So whether you're using a 2-channel mix, you can actually do some amazing things with only stereo channels. We had an engineer into a demo room the other day, and he said, how can I use this for a stereo sound system? I tour. My production manager is not going to allow me to do anything. And so what he ended up doing was we created a stereo mix with his left and right on a space map. And I'll actually share my screen real quick. This engineer came in. He's like, I want to just do stereo. What can I do with just a stereo mix? And so what we did was we created a very simple space map of just a left and a right. Ignore the titles. And then we started adding silent nodes down the bottom, as well as a virtual node in the center. And we started linking the virtual nodes and making trisets. And so we simply made some simple trisets like this. Oh, let me add another triset. I'm doing this very quickly just to show you. And then, of course, we wanted to make it a little bit bigger like this. And now we have a space map that is not only controlling pan across left and right, we now have a space map that's also controlling level. So when you combine that and put it in multiple channels, let's say I put it on all of my channels and I have my instruments. Let's say we're doing something like you're doing, Steve. Now I can actually, instead of having to touch a mix fader, I can actually just mix my system and mix the level and the location via the Spacemap Go window. And we can look at it like this. And now this visually represents the level as well as the audio location, the panning of the system. So now I have a panner and I also have a level control for a channel. So this is my fader vertically. If I go down, I'm muted. If I go up, I'm on level. I'm full tilt. And if I go left, I'm only in the left speaker. If I go right, I'm only in the right speaker. So just with a stereo setup, we can now visually mix a stereo system. And this engineer was super excited about that because his band is really into like dynamics and they have a whole bunch of content that you get crazy.